Hello, my name is Inge Patsch and welcome to the series about complexity thinking. Today, 7 characteristics of a complex world. The following presentation is mainly based on this book by Jean Boulton, Allen and Cliff Bowman, Embracing Complexity, which has been a true guideline for me and my understanding of complexity science. So let's get started. First, a complex world is systemic and synergistic. A complex world is systemic. Systemic thinking is something I have made another series about, and systemic thinking basically takes into consideration that there are different actors in the system and they're all connected with each other, and they have different relationships with each other. Some are mutually supporting, some might be opposite, antagonistic manner. And basically, we can look into this web of relationships, for example, by drawing it in a systems loop diagram, as you can see it here. So this means that it's systemic, things are connected, they relate to each other, maybe even they reinforce each other, they balance each other. So that's the idea of systemic. Being synergistic means that multiple causes cannot be simply added. So this means, first of all, there are multiple causes. Nothing is happening just like because of one reason. For example, corona is not just coming from one single virus. It's also the environmental pollution, the way of treatment, the overall health of a person, so his or her whole history, and the strength of the immune system, which eventually is causing, for example, a death case in corona. So you cannot just look into one element and saying that's causing it. And also you cannot just add up elements because they mutually interfere with each other. For example, the lifestyle and the immune system might be strongly correlated with which other diseases a person already had. So this means synergistic. There are multiple causes for one effect normally, and these multiple causes are in turn also related with each other. So it's more than 1 + 1 is 2. Second, a complex world is multiscalar. Let's explore what that means. With multiscalar, we mean that complexity loops, as we have learned in another video of mine, or adaptive loops, exist in different scales. So we will have maybe small organizations, maybe the biosphere of a pond, and this might be part of a bigger biosphere of, let's say, the forest in which the pond is existing. And eventually, both of it would be probably embedded in a bigger ecosystem like the climate zone or in a big national park in Austria, let's say. And there are like systems, or there are loops. This idea of the adaptive loop would happen on all this, like is happening in different levels at the same time. And it's not like connected with, of course they're connected with each other, but it can be that maybe in a big system is currently in the phase of stability, maybe while a small system it has just broken down and is currently in the phase of breakthrough. And maybe even the very small system, because the loops are going faster, has already reached a status of stability again because the loop is moving faster. So we can look into multiscalarity in terms of locations, but also, for example, in terms of time, because there might be processes which take a very long duration, and then there might be faster processes. So if you think about geological processes, might happen on a very big time scale, and then so like the evolution of a species, and then smaller processes such as the birth and the death of a population is happening on a much faster time frame. So this means multiscalar. They are connected with each other. Yet it doesn't mean that they are self-similar. So it doesn't mean that just because a higher or a lower level is in a certain process stage of the adaptive loop, that the other circles at top and the bottom are the same or follow similar patterns. So they can be very diverse, and there also might be different solutions, there might be different system dynamics at place in different scales. So if you think, for example, about a company a bigger company where maybe on a small scale, on the small team size, you would have simply a weekly meeting, which is very informal, and that is enough to coordinate all the work distribution. Maybe on the next level, where the mid-level management communicates with the CEO, you need to have very different patterns of communication established. So they are, of course, connected with each other, but still maybe the optimal solution on a higher level is different than the optimal solution on a lower level. Third, there is diversity, variation, and fluctuation, and this leads eventually to resilience. So let's explore what all these terms mean. Excess diversity is something which is considered absolutely crucial for the stability of any kind of system. Excess diversity means that there are more solutions, more possibilities, how actors are relating to each other and how a process can be actually enacted as there would be necessary. So we call this also the excess diversity or the degrees of freedom. And is this excess diversity that, say, in this graphic, I was thinking about a food chain for dogs, for example. Because dogs have multiple possibilities to feed themselves, they can get it from humans, they might catch some cats or some rabbits, or they might just steal something from the garbage bin. So in a very symbolic manner, that might be excess diversity. In a more biological manner, saying, for example, the function of biodegrading dead wood in the forest, there might be 10 or 15 different types of small insects doing that. So which would give a resilience to the whole system, because there might be many different types of insects able to biodegrade the wood. So if one of them disappears, it doesn't matter. So similar also in this example, if I make the rabbits disappear from the scene, for whichever reason, for the reason that maybe mankind has hunted them down, dogs would still not be dependent just on the rabbits. They would find other sources to eat. So this makes the system, so the system has become a bit less resilient, but still the system is still able to carry a certain amount of dogs. A few other terminologies which are interesting and useful to have in this regard is saying, basically, what is very important to remember is that when we talk about systems dynamics, we very often talk about things like here. So we say the average income of a person is related to the size of the dog he or she has, just an assumption. So we know that there is a relation between these two average factors. And then in system over time, we can observe fluctuations, and you can also see a nice video I have made about the behavior over time, which shows how maybe the correlation between the two is changing over time. But if it's changing, we can talk about a fluctuation when we talk about average factors. Next, these average factors, of course, whatever is consisting, like there are individuals, there are individual actors or agents behind these average factors. So we also look into the agents, basically, which are a very diverse group. So this is where we talk about the microdiversity, saying it's not that everyone is exactly having 2,200 euro, which is the average income, but people are very diverse in many respects, not just maybe in the income aspect, but also maybe in other aspects. And similar, the size of the dog also is, there might be an average size, but again, the dogs are very different, not only in terms of their size, but also in terms of their color, their shape, or whatsoever. And it's also important to remember that while we can summarize things, we can average factors from the individual agent up to an average factor, you can never make a prediction down there and saying because of the average income, I can tell anything about the behavior of those. And there, in complexity thinking, we consider this being one of the main reasons for change and for innovation, because even though this can be average and it can fluctuate over time, it's these individual decisions individual people make which might be able to lead to an overall change on the long run. And then there is also the term of macrodiversity, which is referring to how many different species are in a certain relationship web. So as we had before, there was a bigger macrodiversity when there were still rabbits, and now it's a bit less because there are no more rabbits. And also we see here, for example, in this system, the microdiversity would be much lower, hence it would be less resilient because people would be much more similar, which in complexity science is normally a sign of less resilience, so less stability, and the possibility of a future breakdown. Future is contingent, path-dependent, shaped by context, events, and history. So let's have a look at what that means. So if you think, for example, about the situation billions of years ago when an asteroid hit our planet, and then the dinosaurs were not able to anymore cope with the changes in environment, and eventually they would die off. And because they were a very central piece in the full food web chain which was existing there, all of a sudden small tiny mammals which didn't play any essential role before, they were like on the really side notice in this food web chain, all of a sudden became more and more important, and eventually we emerged from them, being now a mammal talking about the dinosaurs. So what do we learn from that story? From that story we learn that the particular time of events, in which order they happen, has a very strong influence on the eventual outcome. So it is this when in the system a certain event interferes and makes a change, makes a difference. To give you another example, it also can explain to us, for example, why maybe two similar looking villages during a drought are both handling the situation very differently, because maybe in one village the elderly chief just died, and hence they were without leadership, and there was no proper council held, and they didn't really know how to organize themselves, and maybe they were hit much harder by a drought than another village where, in positive example, maybe just a microfinance women's group was created, and women were much better connected than maybe in the other village, and they would support each other. So this would be two examples on how the particular history of a system is having a huge change on the outcome of what happens when a tipping point is reached and a system is changing somewhere else, or what also happens in the normal process which is in the system. This does not mean, though, that this is a causal or deterministic worldview. So it doesn't mean that if you do A, B will automatically follow, or saying the pathway where you're going is exactly given. It more can be used to say if two actors do A, one might get B and one might get C, and the reason for two organizations or two actors or agents doing the same thing with a different result would be exactly this, that it's path dependent and the events shape it. Fifth, a complex world is resilient to change and can tip into new regimes in an episodic manner. So what does that mean? So when talking about complexity thinking, we talk about being in a certain regime. A regime means there is a dominant pattern of relationships, the way how things are handled. So I would say, for example, the regime of our society here over in Austria, we handle a lot of things through the economic sphere, we trade things, there is still a very strong feeling for family, etc. So these are all the way how an organization, a situation, a system is organized is given. So you have a certain amount, you have fixed relationships, they might vary on an agent's level, but overall the patterns stay the same. And you have a very fixed set of dimensions, a word I will come back later briefly. So you have the same variables basically occurring. And then there is a tipping point, and then this tipping point is not always open. It can open sometimes when the right conditions are given, And then if a system reaches this tipping point, it can roll off into another system. So you have to maybe imagine this map in a 3D. So this ball would climb up to like the peak, and then it might roll down in this next valley or in that next valley, which might be another regime. And in another regime, there might be total new relationships happening. There would be different dimensions. This means there would be different variables shaping the way we think, the way we deal. Total new concepts like the idea of organizing our economy through the commons could come in, or let's say a holistic viewpoint on medicine. So something which has not been considered before would all of a sudden enter the field and be a very important variable. So it would be much of a very qualitative change, not so much of a quantitative change, but it would be a total different regime, as we say in complexity thinking. So an example for something like this might be the breakdown of the Berlin Wall, for example, or the Arab Spring. These would be definitely two moments where such a tipping point happened. And within a few days, there was a big change. Things got mobilized, and whatever was afterwards was radically different from what was there before. Even probably the outbreak of COVID-19, I would say, was one tipping point, which radically changed the way the system was before. And just remember this sentence, it was unimaginable that. So this is a typical sign that before that we were in a different regime, and now we seem to be in another one. Whether we have settled in that one or there will be still another regime, I think this is still unsayable at the moment. But it seems like we're in the middle of such a window of opportunity, of such a time frame where we are on a tipping point. And the big question is now, into which new regime, into which stage space would this role of our new reality roll? What else is important to know about tipping points and episodic change? Episodic means already, as we heard, for very long nothing is happening, and then change might happen very sudden, like stepping up or stepping down or just reaching a different qualitative level. And it's very interesting or very important to know that how are we nudging before the tip matters a lot. So it is not, so sometimes, especially I have been working a lot in Nepal now, so I saw all these interventions of development agencies and all this discussion. Does it really help something? Does it not help something? What should we do about it? No, so it matters a lot, actually, like in this example up there, an example given in the book, but could be explained with different others. It's, let's say you're in a society such as Nepal and you try to make awareness about disability and including disabled people in society and so on. So you keep on talking and talking, and on the surface level, it seems like nothing's happening. You know, like you keep on working, but there is not really big change. But then maybe when a tipping point comes, a certain amount of people is ready to act differently, or to maybe in this moment then make sure that the regime is not going down this way, but that hill. So the nudging before the tip makes a huge difference. Maybe in the moment the tipping point has already been reached, nudging might be too late. That's what complexity science, the mathematical models, would teach us. Another example here, this is something what I'm dealing with a lot, and I'm dealing also with in other videos, is the idea of our currently monetary system. In one of the other complexity videos, I already mentioned that the current financial system seems to be in an absolute locked-in situation from a complexity thinking's point of view. Hence, now talking about how a new monetary order could look like, what would be the possible alternatives to the system which we have now, what would be an egalitarian financial system, what would be a financial system which would look after nature as well, and preparing people for different alternatives, even though they cannot do something with it right now because the system in which they are is still locked in and therefore in a rigid state. It could be the right thing still to do, to say, okay, you create awareness of this, because then in this moment the system is breaking down, and maybe the big inflation or whatever might happen will happen. They have heard about alternative currencies, they have heard about local money, they have learned about handling things through the commons, and they can then directly make use of it because they have these tools available. Yes. Next, there is more than one future, which is another learning. I think this is a very uh, simple one, but still. So apparently, in a complex world, we cannot predict the future, which seems to be a rather obvious statement. But if you really think about it, like if you want to say in general, the future is per se unpredictable. The future is unknown in principle. It's still something many people don't like to hear about it, or maybe we just sometimes neglect this notion that you could say, okay, the future is in principle unknowable, because there are so many complex varieties. Yes, number 7, self-organization, self-regulation, and emergence. So another 3 terms which are very much at the baseline of what complexity thinking is. So self-organization is the process of change. So this is in the moment when relationships form. Maybe you remember from one of my other videos, the adaptive loop. This is happening a lot in the beginning of such a cycle, directly after breakdown. New relationships would form. So this is more or less this process of change. This can also happen later in the process, but this is this process of, yeah, new things are forming, relationships are created. So it's from out of the chaos coming into some kind of stable pattern. While self-regulation means you have now a certain norm, you have typical relationships between different agents in the system, and now they just fluctuate around this norm. So they wobble in a way like a self-regulating, like the sweating of our body is a self-regulating mechanism to keep our temperature at a kind of certain level. Yeah. And then there is another term called emergence. So when we talk about self-organization, we basically talk about that there have been the same set of variables, the same dimensions at play, and all we do is like connecting them in a certain manner. While emergence means that there come some radical, absolute new features which have not been existing before, which also were not predictable. It's like a new variable is added in this mathematical calculation, which was not there before. And in a practical example, that would be the introduction of the mobile, for example, which added something absolute radically new, which didn't exist before, which was also not predictable, and which changed a lot of patterns. So it had a lot of influence on how really relationship would change without being really a tipping point, because it didn't really change the regime which we were in. We're still following, but it still had a strong impact on how the relationships were. Yes, so these were the 7 characteristics of a complex world. So where does this take us? What are we doing with all these insights now? For me, there are a handful of key insights. Jean Boulton and all the others would say every action becomes an experiment. This is how they would state it when they asked the question, where does this take us? What does this mean to become an experiment? For me, this also means that we need a different culture of dealing with failures, because I make any decision, but in a complex world, I can only figure out the probability in best case where it would end up. But I could even as well, especially in a big intervention, not even know where the probability is. So we need a culture which allows for goals not to be achieved and not stamping someone to be a failure because of this, because it's not in the hand of us very often what is actually happening at hand. We need a new culture of understanding and appreciating that the future is much more complex as that we could predict what would happen. This also means for me that we should stop expecting the impossible from our leaders. So I think also we are should be all encouraged to embrace, and that's I think why they called their book Embracing Complexity. We should all embrace the idea that this complexity is there, and that we shouldn't stick on to wanting a certain kind of certainty, which is in the anyway a false hope for something which is simply not achievable and might in best case be the best educated guess, but might as well lead us to a kind of disappointment. So just saying, okay, from the beginning onwards, saying, I don't want to have 100% guarantee on what would the future bring, but I'm ready to take this chance and say, okay, let's take this experiment and let's walk down the road together, and we will together figure out where to go, take the next turn, then would be a good approach. Does this mean we should do nothing? We should just let things happen and just be fatalistic about life? No. Of course, we should still be informed, we should be prepared. As we said, we should maybe nudge in a certain direction where we feel that would be a better quality in any future regime to come. But then we shouldn't be shocked if things turn out in a certain different way as they were. I think as long as they're going in the basic direction and they feel better than what was there before, it's fine. I hope you have enjoyed this rather long video about 7 characteristics of a complex world. And I hope to see you again in another video, and have a nice day.